For years, Putin has been telling the world one thing about its capital with complete confidence. Moscow is untouchable. 3 separate rings of air defense encircle the city. Over 100 missile launchers point skyward at any given moment. Pantsir systems sit on rooftops, on bridges, on purpose-built towers, and in parks. The most densely defended airspace of any city on the planet, designed to make the very thought of striking Moscow feel like an act of profound military delusion. Putin built this shield over decades and presented it to the Russian public as proof of something important. Not just that Moscow was safe, but that Russia was winning. That the war was far away. That the people watching state television in their apartments had absolutely nothing to worry about. Then, in the 3rd week of June 2026, a single photograph appeared online. At first glance, it looked ordinary. A military vehicle parked in the lot of a Moscow shopping center, just a few hundred meters from the city's main oil refinery. But that image shattered one of Putin's biggest myths. Analysts looked at that vehicle and immediately understood what they were seeing, because that vehicle had 2 things on it that had absolutely no business being anywhere near a Moscow parking lot. And what those 2 things tell you about the state of Russia's air defense, about this war, and about what Putin is actually afraid of right now, is the story worth understanding before anything else. On the night of June 18, 2026, Ukraine launched what Russian media themselves described as the largest single drone assault on Moscow since the war began. Somewhere between 130 and nearly 200 drones approached the capital in coordinated waves. Russia claimed its air defense intercepted the vast majority, but several drones reached their target, the Kremlin oil refinery in southeastern Moscow, a facility that supplies roughly 40% of the capital's own gasoline and sits 10 miles from the Kremlin. Fires broke out at least 5 points across the plant. A cloud of black smoke covered the southern part of the city for hours. Satellite imagery confirmed damage to a primary oil refining unit rated to process 140,000 barrels per day. Reuters cited estimates that the refinery would be offline until at least the end of 2026. And Putin did not comment publicly. What happened in the hours immediately after the strike is where this story actually begins. Because Russian military planners, watching their capital's largest refinery burn, made a decision that tells you everything about the state of their resources. They started pulling air defense systems from somewhere else and rushing them to Moscow. OSINT analysts began tracking the movements within a day. A Pantsir S-1 system appeared on camera being positioned near an exit from the Moscow Ring Road, the major highway encircling the city, several hundred meters from the Kremlin refinery's perimeter. A second Pantsir was already stationed nearby on a purpose-built tower in a forested area adjacent to the plant. Within days, at least 3 to 4 Pantsir systems of different modifications were clustered within a 300-meter radius of the refinery, all positioned on the highest available ground. RBC documented what was happening and described it plainly: an unprecedented concentration of air defense hardware around a single facility, assembled under emergency conditions in the days following the strike. Then analysts looked more closely at the specific Pantsir that had rolled into the shopping center parking lot on the Ring Road. And 2 details in the footage immediately separated this machine from everything else in Moscow's established air defense infrastructure. The first was the cage. A protective metal mesh structure was welded to the top of the vehicle's cabin. Defense Express stated explicitly that this modification, designed specifically to protect a crew against short-range FPV drone strikes in close combat, had never previously been observed on systems assigned to protect Moscow. It is a battlefield modification. It is made in the field. It is made by crews who have been under attack and needed protection against the kind of drone that flies directly at a vehicle and detonates on contact. Its presence on a system now parked near a Moscow shopping center meant one thing to every analyst who saw it. This machine had come directly from somewhere significantly closer to the fighting. The second was the missiles. A fully operational Pantsir carries 6 interceptor missiles on each side of its turret, 12 in total. The launcher visible in the footage held 2 rounds on the visible side. A system positioned to defend a strategic asset against mass drone attack, the exact scenario it had just been deployed to handle, had arrived with 1/3 of its expected ammunition. That gap could mean one of 2 things. Either the system had been firing elsewhere and had not been restocked before redeployment, or Russia's supply of Pantsir interceptor missiles was thin enough that even newly positioned systems were not arriving at full capacity. Defense Express suggested both possibilities deserved serious consideration, and the footage alone could not resolve which. But then came the detail that closes this block with a completeness that no analyst could have written better if they had tried. The Pantsir that had already been positioned on the purpose-built tower in the forested area behind the refinery, the one that was already there before the June 18th attack, had fired its missiles during the drone barrage. One of those missiles missed its target. It struck a fuel storage tank inside the Kapotnya refinery itself. Russia's own air defense system, positioned specifically to protect the plant, set the plant on fire. Russia's response to all of this was to keep bringing in more systems. Satellite imagery from June 4th, 2 weeks before the June 18th strike, had already shown construction beginning on a brand new S-400 installation west of Moscow, at one of the highest elevation points in the area, matching the size and geometry of existing Moscow S-400 positions. The fortification of the capital had been underway before the largest strike of the war hit it, and it accelerated significantly after. The question every analyst is now asking is the one that should be forming in your mind too. Every Pantsir that arrives in Moscow came from somewhere. Every system positioned on a tower near a refinery is a system not sitting in the position it left. And the only way to understand the full significance of what those photographs reveal is to look at the complete picture of where all of this hardware is being concentrated, and what that concentration is costing the people who no longer have it. In May, an enormous Me-26 heavy-lift helicopter, one of the largest transport aircraft ever built, was filmed carrying a Pantsir system through Moscow's skies and lowering it onto the roof of a 42-story building called Nord Star Tower. By the end of May, at least 4 separate Pantsir systems had been placed on Moscow high-rises using this exact method. Think about what that actually requires. You don't casually lift a multi-ton military vehicle onto a skyscraper roof unless you consider the threat serious enough to justify the operation. And the S-400 site under construction west of Moscow matched the size, shape, and elevated positioning of every other Moscow S-400 installation. This wasn't improvisation. It was systematic capital reinforcement, planned and underway weeks before the June 18th strike that made headlines around the world. Then, on June 24th, President Zelensky put numbers to what satellite images and rooftop footage had already been suggesting. He said, "In the Moscow region alone, they have amassed hundreds of launchers. Nearly 90 launchers have been redeployed to Valdai from other regions of Russia." Valdai is the town roughly 500 kilometers northwest of Moscow, where Putin maintains a private residence. Now, here is where honesty matters. A PPBS and multiple Western outlets reported these figures while stating plainly that Zelensky's numbers could not be independently verified. 90 launchers, hundreds around Moscow. Those specific figures rest solely on Ukrainian intelligence sources, so take them for what they are. A claim from the Ukrainian government, not a confirmed fact. But here is what makes this claim genuinely difficult to dismiss. The behavior Zelensky described had already been physically documented, weeks before he ever mentioned a number. Anti-drone protective netting, the exact kind used on frontline equipment, had already been installed over truck parking areas along the highway approaching Putin's Valdai compound. 7 purpose-built Pantsir towers had already been constructed around that residence, according to independent military analyst Mark Krutov. Nobody needed Zelensky's number to see that Putin's personal residence was being turned into a fortress. The construction crews had already done that visibly, on camera, before the ultimatum ever became public. So which part of this should you actually trust? The specific number of 90 is unverified. The underlying behavior, systematic redeployment toward the places connected to Russia's own leadership, is confirmed independently and repeatedly. And then comes the piece of evidence that requires no numbers from anyone, Ukrainian or Russian, to understand. On June 22nd, 4 days after the largest drone assault on Moscow of the entire war, Ukrainian forces struck a defense industrial plant in Voronezh Oblast. What did that plant produce? Components for Russia's Kh-101 cruise missiles, components for Iskander-K cruise missiles, and components for Pantsir S-1 air defense systems. Think about the timing here for a moment, because it is almost too precise to be coincidental. The exact same week Russia was scrambling to pull Pantsir batteries from wherever it could find them and rush those batteries to Moscow, Ukraine hit the factory that manufactures the parts needed to repair and replace those very systems. Russia was trying to patch a hole in its air defense inventory at the exact moment its capacity to manufacture replacements was being degraded from the inside. That is not bad luck for Russia. That is a coordinated pressure campaign hitting both ends of the same supply problem simultaneously. And if you still need confirmation that this shortage is real, not exaggerated, not spun for propaganda purposes by either side. Look at what Russia itself has started doing to compensate. Ukrainian defense advisor Serhiy Bezkresnov reported that Russian forces had begun mounting air-to-air missiles, the kind built for fighter jets to use in aerial dogfights, onto truck platforms and firing them from the ground. Why would any military resort to something this improvised? Bezkresnov's sourcing gave the answer directly. There are not enough Pantsir systems for the entire country. Picture that for a second. A nuclear-armed superpower with one of the largest defense budgets on the planet is bolting jet fighter missiles onto pickup trucks because it has run out of the actual system designed for the job. That is not a temporary inconvenience. That is a military improvising because the inventory it built its entire defensive doctrine around no longer covers the territory it needs to protect. Here is one more question worth sitting with for a moment. Ukraine hit the Kapotnya refinery on June 16th. Then it hit the same refinery again on June 18th, just 2 days later, in an even larger wave. Why strike the same target twice in less than a week? If you're enjoying this kind of in-depth military and economic analysis, hit subscribe and stay with us. The easy answer is that the first strike simply didn't finish the job. But that answer misses what Ukrainian officials and Western reporting both describe as the operation's actual point. The Telegraph's reporting on the redeployment described the mechanism directly. Ukraine had increased the frequency of its large-scale attacks, hitting the same target class repeatedly and in quick succession, specifically to observe how Russian air defense responded each time. Where did Russia move its systems after the first strike? How long did that movement take? What did it leave uncovered while it happened? Every time Russia repositioned a Pantsir to cover a freshly struck site, Ukraine could watch that repositioning unfold and learn exactly where the next gap would open. This is not persistence for its own sake. It is reconnaissance disguised as bombardment. Each strike is both an attack and a diagnostic test, mapping Russia's defensive reflexes in real time. Defense Minister Fedorov described the underlying intent without softening it at all, speaking at a RUSI conference. The campaign was explicitly designed to wear down Russian forces, not destroy them outright in a single decisive blow. Wear them down, strike by strike, redeployment by redeployment, until the system managing Russia's defense simply cannot keep pace with the demands being placed on it. And Zelensky connected the military logic to something far more personal and far more damaging politically. He said, "They are protecting their power, the source of this war." That single sentence turns a story about missile counts and radar coverage into a story about what Vladimir Putin actually fears most when everything else is stripped away. Now consider the financial reality beneath all this pressure. The numbers make Russia's position genuinely difficult to sustain over time. A single Pantsir interceptor missile costs somewhere between tens of thousands and several $100,000, depending on the exact variant, though Russia has never published an official procurement figure. Every drone that forces a Pantsir crew to fire expends missiles that take months to manufacture, and, as the Voronezh strike demonstrated, depend on a supply chain Ukraine is now actively targeting. A single saturating wave of 130 to nearly 200 drones forces dozens of those expensive interceptor launches within a matter of hours. Ukraine's deep strike drones, by contrast, cost a small fraction of what Russia spends trying to shoot them down. The financial equation runs entirely in one direction, and it runs that direction every single night this campaign continues. So, put the full picture together. Ukraine hits the same target repeatedly to map Russian weaknesses. Ukraine hits the factory producing replacement parts at the exact moment those parts are needed most urgently. And Ukraine forces Russia into an exchange rate where every successful interception costs more than the weapon it destroyed. This is not a campaign built around a single dramatic strike. It is a campaign built around forcing an impossible choice, night after night, until that choice becomes visible to the entire world in the form of a battle-worn Pantsir sitting in a shopping center parking lot. Russia has been forced into that choice, and now it's time to look at what the front line actually looks like in the places where the answer to that choice left nothing behind at all. To understand what a missing Pantsir actually means for a soldier in a trench, you need to understand what that specific system was built to stop. Pantsir is one of the only Russian platforms capable of reliably detecting and destroying large, slow-moving drones flying low to the ground. Ukraine's heavy bomber drones, the kind soldiers on both sides have nicknamed Baba Yaga after the witch of Slavic folklore, fall exactly into that category. These machines now carry payloads of up to 15 kilograms and operate at extended ranges, dropping munitions directly onto trenches, supply vehicles, and command posts. When a Pantsir battery sits nearby, a Baba Yaga operator faces real danger. The system can track it, lock onto it, and shoot it down before it reaches its target. When that Pantsir battery has been pulled out and sent toward Moscow instead, the same drone can loiter overhead almost unbothered, choosing its target at leisure and returning to do it again the next night. This is not a theoretical concern. It is already showing up in the strike record. On June 22nd and 23rd, in the same window that Pantsir systems were being photographed heading toward the capital, Ukrainian forces destroyed a Pantsir S-1, an S-300 launcher, a Nebo-U radar station, and a Zu-23 anti-aircraft gun in occupied Crimea, all in a single overnight operation. On the exact same day, Ukrainian glide bombs destroyed a river crossing near Vasilivka, on the Zaporizhia front, a crossing Russian forces had been relying on to move troops and supplies. And separately, Ukrainian drones struck the main rail yard in occupied Berdyansk, more than 100 kilometers behind the front line, with NASA's fire detection satellites independently confirming the heat signature at the site. None of these individual strikes proves on its own that Moscow's reinforcement directly caused each specific loss. That precise chain has not been documented strike by strike, but the pattern is impossible to ignore. Every one of these successes happened in the exact window when Russia's own defensive assets were being pulled away from the very sectors where soldiers needed them most and sent hundreds of kilometers in the opposite direction. And the soldiers who are actually living through this shift are not staying quiet about it. Russia's own military blogger community, the pro-war voices who have spent years defending every Kremlin decision no matter how costly, had already been sliding into open pessimism for months by this point. But something about the June 18th Moscow strike specifically cut through in a way earlier attacks hadn't. Russia Post's ongoing interviews with Z community analysts described this exact strike as having particularly unsettled them. From previous attacks the same bloggers had managed to explain away or dismiss. One of their most frequently repeated fears, according to that reporting, was precisely the scenario now playing out in public, that air defense systems would be pulled out of combat sectors and sent back to protect Moscow, leaving the men actually fighting this war with less cover than before. Think about what that means. The propagandists whose entire job is to keep Russian morale steady are themselves worried about the exact thing Zelensky is now saying publicly. When the people paid to defend a decision start privately fearing that decision instead, that tells you something the Kremlin's official statements never will. The complaint underneath all of this anger is simple, and it is the same complaint whether it comes from a Ukrainian president or an anonymous Russian soldier posting from a trench. Moscow gets the new S-400 site. Moscow gets systems airlifted onto skyscraper roofs. Valdai gets its own dedicated defense towers and truck-mounted netting along the approach roads. And the men actually facing Ukrainian drones every night get whatever is left over once the capital and the leadership's private residents have taken their share first. Russia made its choice, and the soldiers and the bloggers both know exactly what that choice was. So what does it actually mean strategically that a government at war has decided to protect itself before it protects the war effort? And where does that decision leave Russia by the time this campaign has run its course? Go back, one more time, to that photograph. A battle-worn Pantsir, mesh cage still bolted on from frontline service, 2 missiles sitting in a rack built for 6, parked in a Moscow shopping center lot beside a burning refinery. That single image tells you more about the true state of this war than any official Russian statement has offered in months. Russia spent 4 years insisting this war would never reach its own soil in any meaningful way, that Moscow was untouchable, that the fighting was a distant, contained problem for soldiers hundreds of kilometers away, not something ordinary Russians or their leadership needed to think about. And when Ukraine's drones proved that assumption wrong, not once but repeatedly, the response wasn't to hold the line and accept the risk. It was to pull the very machines protecting soldiers in combat, the ones with the scars of that combat still welded onto them, and send those machines home to guard a refinery 10 miles from the Kremlin. ISW's assessment as of late June remained direct and unambiguous. Ukraine's intensifying strike campaign was imposing what the analysts called competing requirements on Russian air defense across both the front line and the deep rear. And the trend toward prioritizing Moscow was continuing, not reversing. Fairness requires acknowledging the limits of what we actually know here. Moscow's air defense, even after all of this, remains substantial. Zelensky's precise numbers, the 90 launchers, the hundreds around the capital, cannot be independently confirmed and should be treated as a claim rather than a fact. Russia has proven throughout this war that it can absorb enormous pressure and adapt in ways analysts don't always predict. And the direct causal link between the Moscow redeployment and every individual frontline loss remains, in places, more inferential than proven beyond doubt. But some evidence needs no verification because it is simply visible. Ukraine struck the factory manufacturing Pantsir components in the same week Russia was scrambling to find enough Pantsir systems to protect its own capital. Russian forces are now firing fighter jet missiles from the backs of trucks because the purpose-built system for that job has run short, and a machine pulled from combat still wore the cage soldiers welded onto it for survival, because nobody had the time, or perhaps the parts, to send it back looking like it belonged in a capital city rather than a war zone. These are not claims. They are photographs, satellite images, and confirmed OSINT geolocation. They are the physical record of a government answering, without ever choosing to say it out loud, a question it clearly hoped it would never have to answer in public. When the choice finally came down to protecting the soldiers or protecting the Kremlin, Putin protected the Kremlin. The cage on that Pantsir wasn't put there by a factory technician following a blueprint. It was welded on by soldiers who needed it to stay alive. And now that same cage sits in a Moscow parking lot, still doing its job, just guarding a different set of people than the ones who built it to survive. This is the Frontline show. If you want to see why Russians are queuing for gas while Moscow burns fuel on drones, click the video on your screen.